Hello, dear listeners. This is part 2 of the previous episode. So if you haven't heard that one yet, you should go back and check that one out first. But even as a standalone episode, if you didn't want to go back, I'd say this is a pretty great conversation. I may be biased, though. But just to remind you where we left off last time, we were talking about the incredibly dishonest framing in the media on the issue of Israel and Palestine, the types of tactics and manipulative language that we've been seeing, and more specifically, we were talking about Jesse Brown of the Canada Land podcast, a well-known Canadian media critic, and how he's been having a, as my guest called it, a Zionist meltdown. And he also wrote a strange hit piece on Shri Pradkar, a Toronto Star columnist, which we also briefly touched upon last time. So yeah, that's what we were talking about in the previous episode a little bit, and we will be talking about it some more in this one. So I just thought I would catch you up on that, and yeah, that's where we were at. And folks, if you enjoy this show, please do consider supporting the podcast via patreon.com/nicemangoes and or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Since fashy fuck Elon has basically tanked Twitter, it's been a pretty rough time for smaller lefty content creators. There's a lot less reach and a lot less engagement. Couple that with how unwelcome pro-Palestinian views are in the current mediascape, and it's getting harder and harder to sustain. So yeah, if you can and you enjoy the show, please do consider supporting it and leaving a review. And now, the episode. Welcome to the Polite Conversations podcast, where every episode is focused on civility, decorum, and good manners. And I'm your lovable, non-controversial host, Ina. If you know me, you know I definitely don't like to ruffle any feathers at all.
Because anyone criticizes it, they're saying, you're saying that the Jews are controlling politics? You know what I mean? But then it goes back to, no, we're not saying the Jews. We're talking about pro-Israel groups that aren't all Jewish.
Right.
I mean, the biggest pro-Israel group in the world, if I'm not mistaken, is Christians United for Israel.
Yeah.
So the anti-Semites talk about their influence. It's just an intimidation tactic. You saw this too at U of T, right? When CJA had that tax judge who's a donor to the school call them up and say, the person you're hiring to run your international human rights program, German international law legal scholar Valentina Azarova, like, I don't know, you might have some problems if you hire her. And then they just dropped her.
What were the problems that she had?
Well, she's actually, her expertise, I believe, is in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And she has expressed criticisms of Israel that are totally mainstream in the international human rights community. She had glowing references from at least one Israeli academic who was like, yeah, she's a great scholar. But again, any sort of criticism of Israel's narrative that it's just this wee small little being that just is forced to completely against its will kill thousands of people is deemed not just anti-Semitic, but a threat to Jewish people. Again, when it became a big scandal, I believe it was Shri Pradkar who broke that story, though it may have been Sean Fine at the Globe and Mail. But again, CJA was just like, this is like an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. You're saying Jews control academia. And it's just like, no, you're the one who's, and that's the frustrating thing with these pro-Israel organizations is they are nonstop conflating Jewish people in Israel. And then when people buy into that conflation, misguidedly, then it's just like, aha, see?
Right.
It's all anti-Semitism. And back to Jesse Brown's attempt to take down of Shri Paradkar, he's talking about Toronto for Palestine, and then he got hold of a spokesperson. And this is Jesse writing. The spokesperson, who identified herself as Farah, but did not provide a last name, said they, quote unquote, 100% stand by their claim that Jews are lying about the events of October 7th. Like, again, this conflation of the Israeli government with Jewish people is, again, I mean, Jesse's doing it, and then he's...
Do you think Jesse is saying that they said Jews, or they actually said Jews?
No, it's paraphrased. He's saying they said Jews. I'm sure they said the Israelis, and he just said...
Oh, really? Oh, my God, that would make it so much worse, because I can completely see the problematic nature of them saying Jews are lying about October 7th. But if they did not say that, that is incredibly fucked up to paraphrase it as that way. If they said Israelis.
Yeah, it's just profoundly dishonest. And you see it again and again with, when Chapters Indigo was postered and had, red paint spilled on it.
Okay, so... yeah, Chapters Indigo is like our biggest bookstore chain, massive, massive organization, and the CEO is Jewish, but also started a foundation to recruit and provide scholarships for foreign people to join the IDF. Did I get that all?
Yes, that's right. The Hezeg Foundation. It's specifically for lone soldiers. So people who don't even have family in Israel, but want to fight in the IDF. And so that's made her a target for protest. And Jesse shares a news story with the caption, Jewish-owned bookstore vandalized.
Now that sounds terrible. If someone went to a little mom and pop shop bookstore that has absolutely nothing to do with Israel, that is 100% an anti-Semitic act. But that's not what happened.
Yeah, and it's also Chapters Indigo is a publicly traded company, so it's owned not by Heather Reisman, but by its shareholders. And I know he didn't give this much thought, but if he's insinuating that all of Chapters Indigo's shareholders are Jewish, or the majority of them is, some would say that that's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I feel like he probably wasn't, saying that, but the dishonest framing of this massive bookstore chain who is getting criticized specifically for recruiting and funding IDF soldiers is targeted because it's a Jewish-owned bookstore. That's not at all the case. It's so frustrating to see that, this guy who calls himself a media critic is fully being this dishonest on this issue. And then I believe someone called him a emoji millionaire or something, because apparently...
emoji bitstrip millionaire, because that was actually how he made his money. He started Candleland with.
Right, so he has, he started this Bitmoji thing, or...
Yeah, you remember he was big for, a second. These, sort of Bitstrip, these comic strips that were, I guess, AI generated, and...
you can personalize them and stuff.
Yeah, and he said that that's an anti-Semitic trope. You're saying that Jews have a lot of money, and it's no, she's saying you have a lot of money.
See, it's so crazy that people can do that, because I cannot imagine how much Muslims would be called out for that if they were trying to do that. You know what I mean? It's so crazy to say that you can't say that, he's some Bitmoji millionaire, because that's an anti-Semitic trope. And then there was the story about the Calgary mayor who was invited to a Menorah Lighting, which, she was happy to go to, but then she saw the poster for the event and she saw it had support Israel and like very political messaging, which she did not stand by. So she declined and said she was misled. And then someone said, oh yeah, the Calgary Herald, the paper, implied that she was being anti-Semitic because her claim that she was misled goes back to the old anti-Semitic trope that Jews are conniving.
Yeah, I mean,
and there was absolutely no trickery involved. Like, it's mind-boggling.
It is. I mean, just wild. And that was actually the president of the Calgary Jewish Federation, who was being quoted, uncritically by Calgary Herald columnist Dom Braid, who said that this shows Jody Gondek isn't fit to be mayor. And
she's also a person of color. So
yeah,
I'm seeing that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, Sohi too. Here in Edmonton, Amarjeet Sohi is also Punjabi and is a refugee, I believe. After October 7th, he, I think, issued exactly what mayor of a diverse city should say when something like October 7th happened and everyone knew what was going to come next. He said that there are Jewish Edmontonians, there are Palestinian Edmontonians, and he just wants them to know that they're all in his thoughts. And the Jewish Federation of Edmonton lost their minds. They called it disgusting. And why won't he denounce Hamas, right? And then he issued a clarifying statement just adding, like, yes, Hamas's terrorist attack was horrible, but same message intact. And they said, well, that's not good enough. This is still awful. I mean, he's creating moral equivalence between Israel's righteous efforts to defend itself and, Hamas raping and killing babies, Yeah, I mean, it's just so perverse. But it is good to see some politicians push back against it in the ways that they feel able to. And in Calgary, I know Jen Gerson, who runs this website called The Line. She's like a former National Post columnist who started this exciting, fresh, new, edgy publication on Substack called The Line, which, if you read it, is just the same drivel you read on the op-ed pages and all of Canada's newspapers, but she swears and it's longer. And she was just going to town about how irresponsible this was of Gondek. She talked about the events poster and how it had all these children's activities and was saying, oh, wow, yeah, that screams pro-war rally. And it's like, well, what about the big bold letters in the middle that say supporting Israel? But again, it's just pure bad faith. And I mean, in Gerson's case, it's just pure clout chasing, in my opinion, just getting clicks off of the right-wing anger machine. In Jesse's case, I think there is a deep-seated historical trauma I can very much relate to and empathize with. But at a certain point, when you see just the horrors coming out of Gaza, my sympathy really runs dry. And I think for me, well, a couple things, but Jesse decided to release this audio essay. I think you called it an op-ed.
Yeah, I heard that.
That was titled, "Is Jesse Brown a Zionist?" And it's like, well, obviously he's fucking and I didn't listen to it because life is short and I know what he thinks on this issue. I've seen enough of his tweets. I don't think if he said anything interesting on this issue, I've yet to hear it.
But it was basically accusing people of demanding to know what kind of Jew he is, and he was like, well, I'm not going to tell you, or something like that, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that sounds, and the reason I didn't listen to it was because I read the description, and it was people are telling Jesse, you need to stop talking about anti-Semitism. And it's I mean, I guess probably there are some people on Twitter saying that, but I'm not saying you should stop talking about anti-Semitism.
No,
I'm saying you
yeah.
should stop talking about anti-Semitism in a profoundly damaging and dishonest fashion that only dilutes the seriousness of anti-Semitism in the diaspora, in doing so in a way that is clearly designed to distract people from what's happening in Gaza.
Yes. And like the ADL has very kindly demonstrated how these two things can be so separate, in the way that when Elon Musk publicized this, agreeing with this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that was like, great replacement, like that kind of ideology has been spouted by people who shot up synagogues. So dangerous. And here's Elon Musk boosting that and giving it legitimacy. Then the ADL, the very next day, decides to praise Elon, because he also said that any talk of decolonization or from the river to the sea will be banned because it's an incitement to genocide or some bullshit like that. It just shows how hollow and empty their concerns for actual anti-Semitism are. If you're willing to overlook that when someone as powerful and influential as Elon can endorse an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and the next day you praise him because he also is going to be banning criticism of Israel.
Yeah, and I mean, there's been a lot of internal dissent at the ADL about that.
Right. I saw that today.
Yeah.
That someone quit.
Yeah, that's actually the latest. I know Jewish Currents, which is a great left-wing Jewish publication, has been really doing some great work before and after October 7th on holding the sort of mainstream Jewish establishment in the United States to account. But speaking of which, there's also been internal dissent at Canadaland.
Right. Their union put out a statement.
Yeah, and I thought it was a very measured statement. I know people who work at Canadaland. Again, as I said, there are a lot of great journalists and people who work there. And, the newsroom, I don't think it'll surprise anyone to know, has been tense. While Jesse's been just on this tear, just like slandering people as anti-Semitic, and mostly people of color, by the way, which, as you've noted, is a pattern. It was that Shri Pardkar hit piece that was really the sort of straw that broke the camel's back, I think. And so the union issued a statement pointing out what I think many people, including myself, were pointing out, that Jesse is doing immense damage to Canadaland's credibility through this crusade he's on, this disingenuous crusade against anti-Semitism that's actually about silencing criticism of Israel. Of course, all the fucking usual suspects in Canadian media, like Robin Urbach and Jen Gerson and Matt Gurney, who's Gerson's co-editor of The Line, we're all like, how could the union do this? I mean, why don't they put their names to it? And it's like, you've never been in a union in your life, clearly, which is true. But why are they attacking their Jew? Right, they're literally doing like, Media Network's Jewish owner attacked by his employees, right? And never mind that there are people who work at Canadaland who are Jewish who don't agree with Jesse, right? Because it was revealing, and it was like, okay, we know exactly which side of the picket line these people would be on. But it was good to see. I wonder what it's going to actually result in practice, but I think it was good for the entire Canadaland workforce to be like, yes, Jesse has been damaging our credibility, and this hit piece on Shri Pardkar is like gone way too far, and he needs to rebuild trust with us and the audience, and we're willing to rebuild trust with him too if he's willing to take steps. So I mean, we'll see what happens on that front. I think the most disingenuous Jesse post that I saw was probably his exchange with Jeet here.
Oh, I was just going to mention that. Yes.
Yeah. because it's just so, like, it was just the laziest, like, because I think, rightly...
Also a person of color.
Yeah. Well, he rightly pointed out that there's a ton of reporting on how journalist Issam Abdallah was killed by the IDF in Lebanon. As a media critic, this and the really unprecedented killing of journalists by the IDF is worth talking about. Will you discuss? Jesse's response was, thanks for this question on this Hanukkah night, G. But it's a curious one. Given that I cover Canadian media and as such don't talk on Canadaland about the killing of journalists in Mexico, Ukraine, etc., what about me makes you expect me to cover it when it happens in Israel? And so, like, there's a lot to unpack in that response. First of all, there's no prohibition on asking Jewish people questions on Hanukkah. That's first one. Second of all, what is it about me that makes you expect me to cover it when it happens in Israel?
You're posting, Jesse. It's your posting.
Yeah. Yeah, literally the fact that your entire contribution to this issue has been centering yourself in talking about how unsafe you feel as a Jew because of Palestinian activism, right? And the actual incidents of anti-Semitism that he has amplified, and justifiably so, we don't know who did it. I mean, it's Montreal. I mean, there's a lot of anti-Semitism among Francophones in Quebec that has nothing to do with the situation in Israel and Palestine.
Well, and we're also seeing, like, some white nationalists rebrand as anti-war or pro-Palestine. And, fuel...
like Jackson Hinkle.
Or like this account called Stop Zionist Hate.
Stop Zionist Hate.
Yeah.
When I see people retweet that,
I'm God, it's so frustrating.
Yeah. And I know that the people amplifying them don't realize what it is, but...
that was their intent.
Yeah, exactly. But anyways, Jeet points out to him that he's talked about the press situation in Ukraine. Surely there are Canadian journalists willing to talk about the press situation in Gaza. And then Jesse says, I think you might want to pause and reflect for a minute on why you are directing these questions to me. I suggest it's because I'm a Jew who has been vocal about anti-Semitism in Canada, and you are conducting a purity test.
Yeah, and he also said that both the journalists he interviewed about Ukraine are Canadian. But, like, it's not like you cannot find Canadian journalists to talk about the killing of Palestinians right now. I'm sure you can find someone that is Canadian.
Yeah, it's just he doesn't.
He could talk to you.
He could, yeah. I mean, I've been on Shortcuts before. I found him to be a very gracious host, and I thought we had a good... It was actually about, like, the Ukrainian nationalist stuff we talked about at the beginning, which is something I think him and I agree on. But I'd fucking talk to him about Israel. I know lots of left-wing Jews would talk to him if he's scared of talking to a Palestinian person. And then Jeet points out that his podcast is an outlet for media criticism, and that it's curious that one of the major media stories of our time, the fact that so many journalists are being killed by a Canadian ally, isn't seen as part of its peer review. And I think Jeet nails it when he says, identity politics deflection is boring.
Yeah.
And then Jesse says, you misremembered my post about Jews as posts about Israel. What's that about, Jeet? Can't you tell the difference? Which is, like, so fucking disingenuous coming from Jesse, who has been constantly conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, while being too much of a chicken shit to just come out and say that's what he's doing.
Right. If you want to do it honestly and openly, then say that.
Yeah. Just hiding behind, no, what do you mean? I'm just talking about Jews.
Right.
And
then the Starbucks thing, right? Like, he said the Starbucks that was, what was it, like, targeted by protesters because they support genocide, But then he said that...
Yeah, the Starbucks thing, too, this is interesting, too, because it's a sort of connection between Starbucks' like anti-labor practices and its pro-Israel orientation, because I believe they filed a trademark suit against their union because they used the Starbucks logo in a pro-Palestinian statement.
Oh,
and
wow.
So Starbucks has been target for boycotts. Now, this particular Starbucks was in a neighborhood that has a lot of Jewish people in it, so it might have been ill-advised, but again, he's constantly comparing these protests against businesses to Kristallnacht.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, I feel like... I don't know if it's fair to... like, say that this Starbucks was targeted specifically because it's in this neighborhood, when, I mean, I don't know if we can know that when Starbucks is targeted for a lot of legitimate reasons, you know what I mean? Like, they're being protested because of their, like, yeah, you're right, it's not the best location for them to do it, but it's not like that Starbucks was like the Jewish Starbucks or something, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly. And
like, it's Starbucks.
Yeah, right. Like exactly.
It's a corporation.
And using this corporation as a stand-in for Jewish people is wild. And in comparing all these protests to Kristallnacht, these protests in support of Palestine to Kristallnacht, well,
and BDS. He's like, how can the BDS movement not know about Kristallnacht? It's like,
and it's like, well, if that makes it Kristallnacht, then what is settler violence in the West Bank? What is that?
Right, or them, like, you know, targeting Palestinian stores, and even now there's videos of, like, IDF soldiers, like, just trashing little gift shops and things.
Yeah, and so while I don't want to, I really don't want to be in the position of dismissing concerns about anti-Semitism.
Yes.
But the way this discourse has manifested itself, I mean, leaves people of conscience no choice but to say, yes, anti-Semitism needs to be condemned, but it also needs to be discussed in honest, in rational way. And then the counterpoint that these propagandists always make is, oh, you're telling Jews how to talk about anti-Semitism? Like, oh, you need to listen to Jewish perspectives. And then people listen to a Jewish perspective that they agree with. And it's like, no, not that perspective, only ours. And it's like, okay, so you don't want people to listen to Jews. You want them to listen to the most extreme supporters of Israel and their flunkies.
Right. And this Kristallnacht discussion reminded me of, I don't know if you heard it yet in the last episode, if you finished the whole thing, but like Eric Weinstein did this rant like in early COVID days after the George Floyd protests, and he was like, you know, with the sound of broken glass, every Jew will think of Kristallnacht, and why do black people think they can monopolize this issue of police brutality? Like, he was doing some really weird shit there. Like, he was like, if you think racism and slavery is a problem, then how can you tell me as a Jew that the Holocaust is not a problem? It's like, who is doing that? Who is trying to pit these issues against each other? And who is minimizing the Holocaust because people are talking about George Floyd? Like, that's not something I've seen.
Well, I think it's something that you could call the oppression Olympics.
Right, which these guys love to talk about otherwise.
Yeah, they love to talk about it, but again, they're its biggest proponents, just like when it comes to cancel culture. It's all they fucking talk about, except when they are actively promoting it. And then it's not cancel culture, it's actually ensuring Jewish people are safely insulated from hearing perspectives on Israel that aren't their own, even though many Jewish people hold those views in increasing numbers.
Right. I cannot imagine what that must feel like for a Jewish person that is critical to be in this environment of constant silencing. And I try to think of if people tried to tell me that criticism of Saudi Arabia was anti-Muslim, it would drive me nuts, and it would only make me want to criticize it more.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's where I'm at. I've been as vocal about this issue as I have at this time, because I know, now's not the time to just hang my head and be quiet and just focus on anything else. More than at any time in my lifetime, it's the time to speak out about what's being done in my name, but not just in my name. I mean, you talk a lot about these discourses around Western civilization, right? And I mean, right. Netanyahu saying that explicitly, we are protecting civilization from barbarism.
Yeah.
And those who find that rhetoric troubling when it's used at home by far-right forces need to identify it and criticize it when it's being done with bombs that are supported by Canada or in the United States, of course.
Right. It's been a truly, truly bizarre time to witness. I cannot remember ever seeing things being twisted right before our very eyes, to this extent. And then there was the Friends of the Wiesenthal Center?
Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. So they're the Canadian equivalent, essentially, of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in the U.S., which is a nonprofit dedicated to Holocaust education, but seems to lean heavily on the pro-Israel agitation side of the ledger, which, of course, undermines its very important work of teaching people about the Holocaust and
right.
how these things happen.
Right. And they also state that they want to combat anti-Semitism and hate in all its forms.
Yeah.
But then you shared this story on CBC where the CEO was instructing Holocaust educators in schools to basically report any pro-Palestinian students to the schools and say that the school has an anti-Semitism problem.
Yeah, exactly. In that they need more education from Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center to combat this anti-Semitism. And the head of the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center is a former Liberal MP, Michael Levitt, who anytime the Trudeau government would even hint at being mildly critical of Israel, which is almost never, when he was an MP, he would issue a statement being outraged that the government he's a part of would, single out Israel for criticism or, whatever his Rolodex of talking points told him. Really bad guy, I think. And again, because Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, again, its Holocaust educators went to the CBC reporter Brishti Basu, who's been doing great work on this issue and become a target by pro-Israel forces as a result.
Another person of color?
Yeah. Really makes you wonder.
Yeah. So I'm reading from the screenshot that you shared of the article. So CBC has agreed to keep the employees' names confidential because of a potential risk to their employment. Comments or questions referencing genocide or occupation of Palestinian people and this is the really scary part, anything seen as critical of Israel at all are to be reported to the organization. The idea is to contact the school, inform the school they have an anti-Semitism problem, and pressure the school to shut down the Palestinian support by accusing them of anti-Semitism, encouraging more pro-Zionist workshops or lessons. I mean, this is like straight up Orwellian.
Yeah, I mean, it's McCarthyism, right? It's so thinly veiled.
Yeah.
And you see also Anthony Housefather, who is the other Liberal MP who, and there were a few who were outraged that the Liberals voted for a ceasefire at the UN because the resolution didn't condemn Hamas. Well, the resolution didn't condemn Israel either, but Anthony Housefather is now said he saw what Elise Stefanik did in the States with the presidents of those Ivy League schools. And he wrote a letter signed by several other MPs saying, yeah, I want to do this here. I want the head of every university to write back to me telling me whether calling for genocide of Jews violates its codes of conduct. And if they don't, we're going to force them to testify in front of Parliament. I mean, just, again, this is like it's like this guy learned about McCarthyism and was like, well, he had some good points. He had some good tactics. And it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. Because, I mean, if you watch the video in the States, I mean, first of all, Elise Stefanik is a MAGA chud who believes in the Great Replacement and that George Soros is behind it. And here she is saying that she is standing against anti-Semitism on university campuses, saying that calling for an intifada is calling for the genocide of Jews, which is it's one thing to say it's calling for violence, which is also not true, but it at least has a closer resemblance towards truth than saying it calls for genocide. Genocide? I mean, if the Intifadas were genocide against Jews, then were they towards Palestinians, where more people were killed in both instances? And the first Intifada was mostly non-violent, right? And the second Intifada was definitely bloodier. There were suicide bombings, there were gun battles, but there was also resistance isn't only violent. It's just when people, their only understanding of Palestinians is people who just sit around all day scheming on how they're going to kill Jews, then of course anything but pure submission is seen as a threat. But both Intifadas, I mean, there were strikes and massive peaceful demonstrations and all sorts of completely legitimate nonviolent activities that occurred. And then, of course, calling from the river to the sea is now saying that you want to kill all the Jews. It's just like, which part of that? It's calling for a single state, but the Israelis support a single state, and that's not genocidal, while they're invading hospitals and blowing up ambulances and bakeries and fishing boats and blood banks. But of course, in all genocides, there is this, when you're committing genocide, there is this sense of being victimized by the group you're targeting for extermination or ethnic cleansing. And so it does kind of come with the territory. But I think what's especially troubling is to see so few voices in the mainstream able to or willing to push back against this systematic deception, this inversion of reality.
Right. Yeah, that's really well put. I wonder how long it can last. How much longer can they keep bombing innocent people and claiming they're the ones that are being harmed?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, October 7th obviously gave them the pretext that the Israeli government has been looking for to just wipe out Gaza. And if they're successful in Gaza, they're going to do it in the West Bank next.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, it seems like there's a lot more like liberal sympathy with Palestinians in the West Bank than with those in Gaza.
Is it because Hamas is not in power there? Or?
Yeah, I think it's that, in that there's settler violence. The settler violence, right, is like totally indefensible. Like, you have to be a real like hardcore reactionary bigot to be like, yeah, no, settler, like, because even like Sam Harris, right, is like, oh yeah, settler violence, I don't approve of it. And of course it only matters if it's religiously motivated, right? So of course. And so I think if Israel does sort of, because I mean, it's already happening, at a much slower pace than what's happening in Gaza, but settlers have destroyed like more than a dozen.
But they've picked up the pace since October 7th. Oh, yeah. Like, quite a bit. Yeah.
I mean, for sure, because that's the thing. The settlers are always encroaching on Palestinian territory in the West Bank, and probably soon in northern Gaza, it looks like, once it's just completely destroyed, and they'll build some, beachfront resort for, tourists. But I wonder, like, because part of me is very, I think it's like an optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect type of approach, where part of me says, how much longer can this go on with Israel just getting unconditional support from the United States and in its various institutions and in Canada and the UK and all the European countries. But then another part of me is like, well, if the US had any intention of putting a stop to it or limiting its complicity in this, it would have probably done so, maybe around the time they hit 10,000 dead, 20,000. So, I mean, again, there's no upper limit for Israel's most fervent supporters as to how many Palestinians can die, because no matter how many Palestinians die, it's never Israel's fault. It's always, right? It's this, stop hitting yourself routine Israel does with the Palestinians. Yeah. That, again, I think October 7th did perhaps set back the shift towards sympathizing with the Palestinians to some extent. But yeah, I think since then, Israel has set back its own cause to an even greater extent, because, every day it just pounds Gaza and deliberately attacks its civilian infrastructure and openly boasts of plans to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, first of all, it shows Palestinians that violent resistance is the only way, in that we need to do to the Israelis what they're doing to us, right?
It's really awful, because even things like BDS are criminalized, right. Like, well, that any kind of resistance is just not acceptable.
Yeah, literally, there isn't one. There's no form of Palestinian resistance or even assertions of their existence that Israel and its supporters will accept.
Well, did you see that watermelon emoji? Has a history with the Palestinian flag being banned, and so Palestinians use the watermelon as a symbol of their flag. But now there are some like Zionist accounts on Twitter that are like trying to do the same thing with the watermelon, but like,
yeah, it's anti-black.
What's that? I didn't.
Oh, you haven't? I think probably Richie Torrance, because he's just a shameless.
Oh, are they talking about it from like a racial stereotype kind of?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I hadn't seen that being used yet. But I'm talking about they've taken the watermelon emoji and put a Star of David on it and talked about how amazing Israeli watermelons are. So, like, even the use of a watermelon emoji has just not been acceptable. And that has to be, like, Israeli also.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so bleak.
Yeah, you shared this other post of a headline that said, where is this from? Is it from the National Post? Yes, it is. Okay. Canadian university teacher facing firing for daring to denounce Hamas. I mean, my God, that sounds awful, right? Like, imagine the poor guy just said Hamas is bad and he's now facing firing. But you read on, as you said in your tweet, after 9 paragraphs, the reader is informed that Finlayson, I guess that's the teacher, said a lot more than I stand with Israel. And so what he said is, if you say from the river to the sea, you're a Nazi. I am not neutral. I stand with Israel. I stand against anti-Semites who want nothing but dead Jews, who take millions from their education and healthcare budgets and spend it on making war. Israel has a full right to their land. You stand with Palestine means you stand with Hitler. You don't want peace. You want dead Jews. I mean, whoa.
Yeah, and it gets even worse, right? Just pure dehumanization, right? He says, just like Palestinians, you freely admit this to pollsters. They murdered 1,400 innocents and took 250 hostages, and the people celebrated rapist monsters as heroes. They want a barbaric, primitive Islamic caliphate and hate all post-Enlightenment values. They murder their own people for being gay, and you stand with them. Disgusting. Move there. So that isn't expressing a political view, which, by the way, I have on good authority that academics at Guelph Humber aren't allowed to comment on this topic publicly at all. So right there.
Which sucks in itself, but yeah.
Yeah, which is wrong, and I oppose that. But this is beyond that. It's one thing to say, yeah, I support what Israel's doing. I think Hamas are just like ISIS, blah, blah, blah. Like, obviously it's wrong, but whatever, academic freedom. But this is abusive.
Yeah.
And I did want to highlight, and I think you talked about this a bit in your talking about Harris and Weinstein episode, is that Hamas are very different from ISIS. I mean, they are a conservative, theocratic movement, and I don't want this to be interpreted as a defense of Hamas, but they've cracked down on Salafi jihadi movements in Gaza.
Right.
I mean, there's an ISIS cell in Gaza,
right,
probably a decade ago, and they got rid of it, And so this conflation of any sort of Islamist governance with this international effort to create this caliphate is just totally out of step with the reality, where there are different. Look, I don't support any theocratic movements, to be clear, but nonetheless, there are different gradations within them, right? Like, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, though they've distanced themselves from it in recent years. And the Muslim Brotherhood, on the scale of Islamist movements, is on the liberal end, right? They embrace elections,
right?
And I mean, Hamas hasn't imposed Sharia law on Gaza, which is what its Salafist opponents want it to do.
Right. And this idea that, they kill their citizens for being gay. I mean, I've been seeing more queer Palestinians speaking out about how they were more terrified of being killed by Israel. And they had these, underground queer parties in their neighborhoods in Palestine. So, I read an excerpt from a book, I can't remember which, but about how an IDF soldier saw through, the viewfinder of his gun, two Palestinian men having sex, and then he just shot one because he thought it was funny. And gay marriage is not even legal in Israel, so, like, how? How do you make these claims?
Well, and also, like, surveilling gay Palestinians and threatening to out them unless they snitch on Hamas, right?
And as we've seen, Hamas is basically anyone, right?
Yeah.
Like, just anyone.
Yeah, literally. Anyone. Because, I mean, there's nothing to do with being, a senior commander or what have you, or even like an active militant. It's like literally anyone who has expressed sympathy for resistance, which is really Hamas's main appeal towards Palestinians. It's not that they're Islamist. I mean, their founding charter is a cartoonishly anti-Semitic document.
Of course.
Like, cartoonishly. Like, it was actually, like I thought it was just, Israel's supporters exaggerating. But
no,
it is really...
Yeah.
But it was also made 35 years ago, and they've since, as the movement has grown in support, have stopped using that language. And as I distinctly remember you noting, because I was nodding along... that doesn't mean they were genuine in doing so, but again, when Israel's supporters say that Hamas openly wants to get rid of all the Jews in historic Palestine, that's not true. They don't openly want to do it anymore.
Yeah. That's Israeli cabinet members.
Yeah, they do openly want to. And
right.
What I find especially troubling is this tendency to, and this is tied to equating Hamas with ISIS, or saying it's worse because, they beheaded babies even though they didn't, is saying that Hamas are worse than the Nazis. Have you been seeing that?
Oh, that is such a ridiculous talking point. Like,
is disgusting. Like, Robin Urbach said, at least the Nazis. And it's like, you start your sentence with at least the Nazis. You should shut the fuck up.
You do not got to hand it to the Nazis.
And you should not. And the fact that, again, these people all have op-ed columns in Canadian newspapers where no one's allowed to debunk their bullshit.
It's revisionism, too. It's like Holocaust revisionism to minimize the harmfulness and evilness of the Nazis.
Yeah, and it's like the Nazis tried to hide what they were doing, but the Palestinians broadcasted, Hamas, which, of course, when they say Hamas, they mean the Palestinians, are broadcasting it to the world. And it's like, wow, that's crazy. It's almost as if social media and the political dynamics it creates of radicalization didn't exist in the 1930s.
Right. And I mean, to talk about social media and broadcasting, like, you don't only have to look at the IDF social media posts and their Telegram channels and their TikToks and just horrendous videos that they post themselves. Like that one where they think it's really funny to go and knock on a door and then the camera pans out and you see that it's just rubble and all that's left standing is a door, and they think that's like this hilarious joke. And it's like, why would you film yourselves and then post it for everyone to see how awful you are? And like,
right, and that's, I mean, another concern of mine of what once this is all over, and it's not, my main concern is putting an end to these horrific crimes that are being conducted by Israel in Gaza. And now is, I mean, part of me is, how can you expect Palestinians to want to live alongside these people who are, again, just are so consumed by this hatred of them, right? I mean, ultimately, and look, I have family in Israel, and even if I didn't, like, Israeli Jews, I am firm in my belief, have a right to live in historic Palestine, right? Because I think anyone has a right to live anywhere they want.
Well, I mean, if they're living there, like, it would just be awful to uproot someone and remove them from, like, I don't see how that's a solution at all.
It's like Canada, right? There needs to be a form of reconciliation.
Right.
But, I mean, just with the brutality we've been seeing, how is that even possible?
Yeah.
And for Palestinians. And that sort of also keeps me up at night a bit too, is just, Archbishop Tutu, said that, this occupation is worse than apartheid. It's not just bad for the Palestinians who are being constantly surveilled and harassed and having their movements controlled, but it also corrodes the occupier's soul,
Yeah.
And of course they call him an anti-Semite for that. But it's true. I do have concerns, and they're not my most immediate concerns at the moment. But once Palestinians are free, and I do think it could happen in our lifetime, what's going to happen with the Israelis? I do think that the genocidal assault on Gaza, changes the possibility of two people living together in peace, whether it's a two-state solution or one-state solution or a binational confederation or a series of independent fiefdoms. But again, that isn't, I don't think, should be our number one concern right now when we're seeing what's happening in Gaza.
Right. So have you been to Israel? Have you done this birthright trip?
I didn't do the birthright trip. Because I had been to Israel with my family prior. We actually went in the summer of 2000. So a month, we left a month before the Intifada broke out.
Oh, wow.
And, I was just I was in heaven. I thought it was so, and it really, because I have been to Israel since then with a more, critical perspective. I went to the occupied West Bank in 2012, I think. But yeah, it was just amazing. It is, as a Jewish person, you land at the airport in there, and of course it's built on top of a ethnically cleansed Palestinian village. But as a Jewish person, you go and you see all these signs in Hebrew and all these, Orthodox Jewish street vendors, and it is very welcoming when you're a Jewish person. Mm-hmm. But I remember a few things that, in retrospect, I thought were really fucked up. The first is actually the how openly racist people were towards not Palestinians, because again, that issue wasn't on my radar. I was just Arabs hate Jews, but it was how racist people were towards Yemeni Jews. I remember. Okay. And then you go and you read the history of Yemeni Jews immigrating to Israel, and they essentially had a 60s scoop for Yemeni Jews, where they were placed with European Jewish households to teach them Hebrew, and so they could unlearn their backwards Arabic cultural ways. Yeah, and not a lot of people know about this. It's called the Yemeni Children Affair, I believe. But I thought that was strange. And then it was also, we were on a tour, right? We were on we had a tour bus that drove us around to all the big cities and a tour guide. And I remember the tour guide was pointing out to us the Palestinian license plates on the highway, which at the time, right before the Intifada, Palestinians could use if they got the right permits from the Israelis too. And
which I'm sure are not easy to get, or were not easy to get.
No, and I'm sure you might have to, give up some intelligence to get them.
Oh gosh.
And I remember our tour guide saying that, about how Palestine doesn't exist. And he's they don't have a P in Arabic. They call it Palestine. So they claim to be this identity, but they can't even pronounce it.
As if people don't have their own names for their countries and cultures.
Yeah. And then it's funny, too, because then you hear the Zionist talking point that Palestine is actually just a name the Romans gave to the territory after they destroyed the temple. And again, as if that is like some sort of coherent argument and not just a racist attempt to cast the colonized as being colonizers, right?
Right.
In their, refugee camps. And then one other thing from that tour, and I only reflected on this very recently, was I was 9 years old, almost 10. And as part of our tour, we went to a gun range.
Oh.
And I fired a gun.
Yikes.
For the first time in my life.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Was the last time in my life until I think last year when my friend from Toronto visited me in Edmonton, and I was like, it's very Edmonton. I'm going to take you to the gun range at the West Edmonton Mall. And I think my view on guns from the left is like somewhat heterodox, but in retrospect, I thought that was so fucked up, especially when we're shown these images of Palestinian children, at Hamas schools,
right.
holding guns and talking about how they want to be martyrs. And it's like, I didn't even live in Israel. I had no reason to know how to shoot a gun. And they just took me there and allowed a 9-year-old to fire a gun. And I didn't really think anything of it until I was older. In certain instances, like the gun range, not until like the past year or two. But I think that that's an experience, many Jews of my generation have, where we have intergenerational trauma from the Holocaust too, but it's not as severe and frankly blinding as it is among our parents' generation, and not to mention their parents' generation, which was like, they were right in the thick of it.
Right.
And I think that the more time that passes between the Holocaust and now, and the less defensible Israel, and the more closely Israel comes to represent the Nazis that the state was ostensibly created to prevent.
Like never again. Yes.
Yeah.
That has been fucking with so many people's minds, I'm sure. Like, how do you even begin to voice that comparison? Or like, but like every day you see images and you're like, this is horrifying and also familiar, but how can that be, considering how it's like, it's very weird to even try to grapple with the rounding up of Palestinians and tagging them with numbers and just like driving them into concentrated areas and the open genocidal calls from like politicians and
and I think that there are two like distinct currents of Jewish thought in relation to the Holocaust that I think exist on the spectrum, right? It's not black and white. It's not you're either one or the other. But the first is that in the wake of the Holocaust, it was like, we need to ensure that this never happens again to us. Mm-hmm. And, we need to be constantly vigilant against the prospect or the signs of another Holocaust happening to us specifically. Then there's the other side, which is that we need to ensure that the Holocaust or something like the Holocaust never happens again to anyone. Right. And again, I think you're seeing this increasing polarization between these two perspectives on a generational scale. And, I always struggle with this, when I'm talking about Palestine, because, you don't want to center Jewish perspectives on Zionism, because what Zionism is ultimately what it's done to its victims, the Palestinians, not to mention, Lebanese or even Yemeni Jews, right? But I find it, because the Jewish experience is so weaponized as a means of justifying Israel's conduct, that it almost becomes necessary for Jewish people who are speaking out against it to say, no, not in my name, right? Yeah. It's hard because I do want to also, and for the longest time, when I first started reading critically on this topic, right, I mentioned Chomsky, right, like hours ago, and that was sort of my gateway into, more critical, Norman Finkelstein, who's, kind of gone off the rails. Though he was always half off the rails, and also now that he's going back to talking about things he actually knows about, I have time for him, but Israeli historians like Avi Shlaim and Ilan Pape, and Simcha Flapin, and other diaspora Jews who have spoken out about Israel, like Naomi Klein, or dating back to I.F. Stone, and I think that is a good starting point, just because this narrative that you're either with us or you're with the anti-Semitic mob is so prevalent that it's like, well, hold on, it's not that clear cut, right? But in recent years, I've realized, I should really read more Palestinian perspectives, because in many cases, Palestinian scholars have been saying what was happening to them long before Israelis and Jews were, right?
Yeah, and just personally seeing how much distortion and gaslighting there has been around this issue, just now, people are beginning to experience it themselves. And I can only imagine what Palestinians have been experiencing for decades on this issue. And yet so many of us just didn't hear how severe it was, because firstly, a lot of them were silenced, and then there was this kind of cloud of this is anti-Semitic, and then so people wouldn't want to touch it. And now things are becoming a little more clear, and I think there have been left-wing Jewish voices that are super important in this on this issue, because they can push back more strongly than anyone else can, I think.
Yeah, certainly. Not that I don't get accused of Jewish self-hatred or being a capo or whatever, but it's pretty easy to ignore that, right? Because it's if they had a sound argument, then they would say it, right? Basically, I can take the heat.
It may not have the same impact on you as it would, say, on a person of color who's writing an article, right? Because
and who's not Palestinian, so they don't have an entire supportive community to fall back on. But I think seeing the proliferation of these groups like Jewish Voices for Peace and Independent Jewish Voices, and if not now, have really been, I think, to seeing their prominence at this time.
It's been great.
It has been great, and it also has, because it can feel alienating going up against the sort of mainstream voices of your community who purport
I know the feeling
to speak on your behalf. Oh, yeah, well, exactly. I do think a lot of ways that we can sort of relate, right? You're critical of political Islam, right? And as you should be, but you're also sensitive towards how that morph so quickly into like anti-Muslim bigotry. Of course, the power dynamics at play are like very different, but
yeah, we can definitely relate. But you know what's strange and even more alienating, being in, you know, I don't want to compare, but like to illustrate what's happening with ex-Muslims is that if these groups that you are finding so comforting right now, imagine if they teamed up with like Nick Fuentes to justify his anti-Semitism. Like, they were so mad at Israel, understandably, but they channeled that into, like, legit alliances with anti-Semites. Because that's what's happened to the ex-Muslim movement that started with a noble goal of, like, destigmatizing apostasy from Islam, which absolutely it should be. But then they found that they would get bigger platforms, more funding, and just more attention by aligning with right-wingers and, like, rabid anti-Muslims. And so that's the path that the movement chose, unfortunately.
Yeah, and, if anything, there's a parallel there with sort of the mainstream of the Jewish community that has made common cause with, the most virulent Islamophobes in North America, right? Like
Bill Maher.
Right, like Bill Maher, who, is just such a fucking idiot. I mean, I used to like Bill Maher, actually, when I was younger.
Me too.
Because he was... Like, has he gotten worse, or is it just that...
No, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't think so. I think we just didn't see it.
Yeah, I just think the discourse has shifted so much that it's like, oh yeah, Bill Maher is a reactionary dirtbag.
Right. Like, if you look at his old, stand-up, like, from 20 years ago, like, he's spouting standard, like, MRA talking points. Like, oh, it's, like, so difficult to be a man now. Women have too much, like, feminism has ruined them, or whatever bullshit. But yeah, he sucks.
Yeah, he sucks a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think it was one of those things, like, with Jesse Brown, where I was like, yeah, I know he's, like, bad on Israel stuff, but whatever. I find him funny. He supported Ralph Nader in 2000. But, yeah, he's really not funny at all. And, he's, like, cartoonishly unfunny. Like, it's funny how unfunny he is. Like, I actually remember watching real time for the first time in years when the pandemic first started, and so he was doing it without an audience, and it was actually amazing just to see how unfunny he is, like, when he doesn't have an audience that's, like, instructed to laugh. Yeah. I think you'll appreciate this, is that with the new because I went through a new atheist weirdly around the time I was starting to read Chomsky. I was getting into, like, Dawkins and Hitchens.
Oh, and they hate him, so that's interesting.
Well, Hitchens, that's the thing, because I started reading Hitchens, then I started reading his old work, and seeing a clear difference between, like, even if you watch his old media, like, there's an old debate you can see on YouTube of Hitchens and Edward Said debating Bernard Lewis and Leon Wiesleiter about anti-Arab racism in the media. And so there's Hitchens saying essentially that Islamophobia, which wasn't called that at the time, is real in that it's bad. And his entire demeanor changed, and I think that has a lot to do with drinking. But yeah, weirdly, I mean, I guess because I was a teenager, so I was just exploring all these different perspectives that were, like, different from, like, what I was raised in. Not that the household I was raised in was, like, particularly religious, although I did go to a Jewish day school that was. It was non-denominational. Like, there were, like, the ultra-Orthodox kids who were, like, weird and we didn't, like, really socialize with. And then there were the more, like, regular, because there was more of a cultural thing too, right?
Right.
Like, but I got into the atheist stuff, and it was Sam Harris, really, that made me realize that the whole thing was a total fraud, because he's just, like, I remember taking his book out of the library, and it had this enthusiastic blurb from Alan Dershowitz.
Oh, God.
and realizing that this was just, like, a front for, like, neoconservatism, and then sort of really getting into the evolution of Christopher Hitchens' work, because you read his stuff from the 80s and 90s, it still slaps. I mean, some things maybe haven't aged so well. Like, he had some, like, contrarian takes, but it was like he was like Alexander Coburn, right? Like, they shared, like, column space at The Nation, and then Hitchens did sort of a Greenwald pivot, I guess you could say, but as Greenwald is quick to point out that, like, on foreign policy, Greenwald's he's not bad. Like, it's very, like, isolationist.
But, like his occasional takes just cannot, like, redeem how horrendous he is.
Yeah.
On everything else.
And you were also early to I think you're a really good judge of character, because
thank you.
I remember like a few years ago listening to your interview with Sam Harris back when he would speak to you, and you were talking and you were trying to mildly criticize Sam Harris and point out that Greenwald is a dick, but he just wasn't having any of it. But it is very funny seeing Greenwald now when it comes to Palestine just being like, wow, I can't believe all these right-wingers who said they're all about free speech aren't. Yeah. It's like, I can't believe the libs of TikTok lady doesn't care about like free speech. Fucking clown. But but with Harris is where I started to realize this connection really between the New Atheist Project and support for, U.S. imperialism.
Right.
And this childish view that, Israelis are less religious than the Palestinians, therefore they're less wrong. Which I don't even know if that's true. I mean, because
I don't know either.
Religiosity has certainly grown in Israel.
I mean, there's like a Haredi battalion in the IDF.
Is that true?
Yes. I saw a Vice piece on it. So I cannot imagine like another country recruiting ultra religious people who think they're specifically on a holy war and are soldiers of God and bringing like religious scripture onto the battlefield and stuff. Like, how would that be viewed if like Saudi Arabia was doing it?
Yeah. Or like we're fighting the Amalek. Like that to me, that is like clear that, I mean, either Israel is being driven by religious fanaticism alone, like Islamic fundamentalists are, or the adult view that neither of them are driven primarily by Islamic fundamentalism, or, of course, neither of them are driven by religious fanaticism, in that they're using it as a rhetorical device to justify something else. And there's sorry, I know I'm all over the place here, and I apologize, but did you read that Eric Levitt's takedown of Sam Harris?
I did read it, and I did not, I mean, I liked a lot of it, but I tried to talk to him about, like, because he was all, I do like Harris, and he has this like very ASMR voice, and I'm not like such a big critic of him, but I think on this issue he's very bad. And I was in his comments saying like, dude, like, you can find better critics of Islam. Like, Harris literally peddles the Great Replacement, and his ASMR voice is doing like some pretty horrid extremism out there, but he did not respond. And then there was also the part where he's like, I think Harris talked about like one of our worst in Pakistan attacks on a school. It was like jihadists, and they like, bombed like, I don't know, 100 and something children, I can't remember, but it was a horrific attack. And he specifically talks about that attack and says, well, look, this is how bad jihadists are. They attacked a school in Pakistan, and they didn't have any reason to do it. It's just their, like, jihadism. And that's explicitly, like, untrue, because they stated that it was, like, in retaliation for some, like, army response to terrorism or something. That's why they attacked an army school.
Yeah, and that's I think the good point that Levitt's made, and I mean Levitt's in general, I find him very like wishy-washy, but I think he's a good writer, and I think he's like sincere. Is that he's saying that Harris is saying, oh, we need to take Hamas members at their word, which first of all, I've always thought, why? Why should we do that?
But not white supremacists, okay? Because they're just trolling.
But then Levitz was like, okay, well, then if we're going to take Hamas leaders at their word, then let's not be selective about it and point it to all these statements Hamas leaders have made talking about how they are resisting occupation and that it is about the occupation. And did Harris ever respond to that?
No, of course not. What is he going to say? I mean...
Well, you're taking me out of context. You're vile.
Dishonest, bad faith.
And yeah, I mean, I don't, like, for me, when I was younger, the atheist thing was really appealing to me, even as I sort of grew past this new atheist stuff. I was still considered myself an atheist, but I think as I've grown older, I've realized that I think a lot of that anti-religious sentiment was a product of revulsion on my part from the things about that I was taught were central tenets of Judaism that I found unconscionable. And I think in more recent years, I think part of it is because I lived in a small town for a while where there were like 5 Jews in town. I knew all of them. And there's no Jewish communal life to speak of. There were more like Jews for Jesus weirdos in Medicine Hat than Jews.
Wow, you've lived all over the place.
Yeah, I mean all over Alberta.
And Toronto. You've lived here.
That's true. Yeah. Well, actually, I'm from Thornhill.
Fancy.
Where many Jewish people. Yeah. So you're saying Jews have a lot of...
Oh God, yeah, I know. I was like, oh fuck, why did I say that?
No, it's I was actually hanging out. Avi Lewis was in Edmonton a couple of months ago for a conference we both spoke at, and we were hanging out, and we kept doing that to, like someone would say something about like the Israel lobby, and it's like, oh, you're saying Jews control in a very facetious way. But because again, anything you say will be used against you unless it's like, I stand with Israel. And I mean, I guess that shouldn't inure us from being sensitive towards how we talk about these things, but it also shouldn't force us to tone ourselves down and not be clear-sighted about what's happening right now.
Right. And I really appreciate your voice. And, it's been great to see your posts on Twitter, and just like there's like a few content creators that, have been so great throughout this time. I think Majority Report has been so good.
Oh, yeah. They have been very good. And I believe, Matt Lack is a mutual friend of ours.
He's been great too. Yeah. No, I mean, there's few, but really some really good voices, and they have been very helpful to have. And Matt Lieb too. He started a podcast, and I've been listening to it. I think it's called like Bad Hasbara or something. It's really good. Oh,
I'm not familiar with that. I'll have to check that one out. Also in Canada, Rachel Gilmore has been very good on this now that she doesn't have to answer to Chorus, a major media conglomerate in Canada that owns Global News, where she used to work. And I mean, it's been, a lot of cowardice for sure. That's never in short supply, but it has been good to see. Just
the last thing I wanted to mention before we wrap up is this other thing that you tweeted was like an Instagram a screenshot of comparisons from these 2 posts.
It was actually the same post.
Oh, was it the same post? Okay, they were together?
It was the same, because it was like part of a slide.
Oh, God.
Okay. Yeah. So Yara Sachs, who is Israeli, and people in the replies pointed that out, which I don't think is, in my view, appropriate, because it doesn't matter. We're talking about policy here. But she was trying to reassure her constituents, because she represents actually Michael Levitt's old riding, which does have a lot of Jewish people. But as we have spent the past several hours discussing, Jewish people don't always see eye to eye on really anything, and that includes Israel. But she wants to reassure them that, don't worry, we're letting people from Gaza in. But anyways, sorry, I interrupted you. You were reading the post.
So you're saying this is from the same post, the language that she is used. So she's an MP, right? She's
the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Okay, so for Israelis currently in Canada, the government is exempting fees for applications for study or open work permits for immediate family members of a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, provided they left Israel on or after October 7th, and Israelis already in Canada who feel unsafe returning to the region currently. This will help ensure that Israelis who are already in Canada and Israeli family members of Canadians who came to Canada since October 7th have support in Canada during the war. And then the next slide is like Palestine. I guess she's talking about Palestinians. Secondly, given the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the government is supporting temporary residence visas for extended family members in Gaza who are related to Canadian citizens and permanent residents. This is a limited program. The security concerns are well understood, and the security requirements are strict and follow reviews from Israeli authorities. There is an extensive vetting process, and no security or admissibility requirements are being waived. If individuals are able to exit Gaza through the Rafah crossing, which requires both Israel and Egypt's cooperation, they will need to complete all Canadian admissibility and eligibility requirements before they can be approved to come to Canada. Now that's quite the difference in language. For Israelis coming, it's like, oh, if they feel unsafe, we're waiving all these fees. And for Palestinians, like, we understand the security risks. They'll have to pass this and this and this. And it's like, wow, they're the ones that are being mass murdered right now. And it's just, it's really something to see.
Right. And it's like, I mean, I think the way Israeli immigrants or Ukrainian immigrants are being treated is how all immigrants should be treated. But it's like, are there not Israelis with extremist sympathies that you may want to screen?
Right.
Or are there not Israeli war criminals who may be coming? Well, probably not, because they're doing war crimes right now, but
they're busy.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just, they're criminalizing Palestinians before they even arrive and telling them that their inclusion is completely conditional, whereas Israelis are welcomed with open arms. And now I can actually tie this to my book and bring things full circle, because this is really the sort of immigration policy that Jason Kenney really mastered when he was Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, of this, what a scholar I believe at Toronto Metropolitan University calls neoconservative multiculturalism, which is that, immigrants are welcome. You're welcome to be part of Canada, but you have to fit in to the ideological framework that we're giving to you. And this, I mean, goes further than that, because it assumes Israelis and Ukrainians do en masse and that Palestinians do not. But again, this is a very disciplinary approach to immigration policy that was really the signature achievement of the Harper Conservatives and Jason Kenney that Trudeau did nothing to reverse, and in fact is allowing it to evolve and take this form. Interestingly, they lay out pretty clearly how Israelis can sort of be set on the path to permanent residence. But for Palestinians, it's just like, well, maybe if you behave yourself one day, you can become a Canadian. Of course, I'm sure this year we'll be seeing the Israeli government heighten its efforts to actually get all these Western countries to accept Palestinian refugees so they can turn Gaza into a beach resort. But, it does remind, how can you not be reminded of the fact that no one wanted to take Jews in? when the Nazis were trying to get rid of them, and what happened once there were no places who would take Jews in. Though, of course, I mean, the important difference is that Palestinian people would like to stay in Palestine. Of course, different Palestinian people think different things, but of course, the purpose of the Palestinian national movement is to obtain self-determination in their homeland, not in some country that supports their dispossession.
Right.
So, you know, and I think that's a really tough case of mixed emotions that a lot of Palestinian people have articulated as it becomes increasingly clear that Israel's goal is to destroy Gaza and remove the population.
Yeah, I cannot imagine like what that must feel like, and you feel like it's inevitable that you have to leave or they will destroy you. Like, it's just horrifying beyond belief. But yeah, wow, this has been a great conversation. We've talked about so many deceptive ways of framing things and distortions in the media, and yeah, it's been wonderful chatting with you.
Yeah, it was great. It's been great to finally speak to you, you know, and exchange our voices rather than just, you know, DMing and liking tweets and stuff.
Do you have anything else you want to plug? Where can people get your book? And
you can purchase my book, Kennyism, Jason Kenney's Pursuit of Power, through the publisher, Dungeon Press. If you go to the book page, you can put in your postal code and it will connect you to your closest independent bookstore that you can order it to. It's also available on Amazon, if you're so inclined, Barnes & Noble, if you're American, Chapters Indigo, but don't do that. Also, if you are interested in reading my thoughts on various issues, including the ones we discussed today, I have a newsletter on Substack called The Orchard. I'm currently in a fundraising drive because Tucker Carlson is speaking in Edmonton near the end of the month, and I wanted to buy a ticket and go and cover it for the newsletter. So, but alternatively, you can also just sign up as a paid subscriber. I also co-host two podcasts, Big Shiny Takes, which takes a satirical look at Canada's pundit class that we have spent a lot of time today dismantling, and we sort of read through their worst columns and mock them mercilessly. And then The Forgotten Corner, which is more of like an interview, sort of current affairs-y show. And yeah, I think that is more than enough to plug. So thank you for the opportunity to do that and for having me on to talk to you today.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support it, there are several ways you can do that. You can share it online, talk about what you just heard. You can leave a 5-star review to help others find it too. And you can also subscribe via patreon.com/nice mangoes. No E in mangoes. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter before it's completely wrecked, you'll find me at Nice Mangoes. Again, no E in mangoes.